So it is absolutely an honor and a pleasure to come talk with you this morning, realizing that this is an incredibly diverse audience in terms of your academic backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, kind of where you are in your careers. So I'm really trying to kind of approach this topic of healthy aging from the 10,000-foot view, and we'll try to get through it in about 45 minutes and then save some time for questions and answers. So I'm happy to take them along the way too if there's a point of clarification or something that helps. I don't want to steal too much thunder from my colleagues. I also will thank the organizers of this conference for letting me go first, because I work with Dr. Hansen, Dr. Grabowski, and Dr. Personaire, and it's a formidable task to talk after them, so I'm glad I get to go first for that reason too. But I do want to talk a little bit about dementia statistics and why this is an important topic. For any of you who have a personal, family, or clinical connection to the disease, you know that already, but there are certainly some healthcare economics worth talking about. We'll talk a little bit about the contextual factors that shape the work that we do and some of the things that are going on here in the state of Washington. And then we'll spend most of our time talking about normal age-related changes in cognition. And I will do my best to disentangle this from the Western biomedical conception of cognition. I could probably summarize the vast majority of this talk by saying that we still lack robust, detailed data sets of what objective cognitive aging looks like in American Indian, Alaska Native populations. And could probably turn it over to Dr. Hansen at this point, but there's certainly more to talk about, and there are some nuanced things that are important to discuss as well. I'm reminding you of something you already know, which is dementia is this kind of large umbrella term that includes a variety of conditions of acquired cognitive impairment. So these are things that you're not born with. You acquire them over the lifespan from a variety of different mechanisms. These are things that typically have a progressive course. So they're chronic. We have no disease-modifying treatments. We have no cures at this point. We have no vaccines. They are structurally mediated changes to the brain. So we separate this out from functional causes of cognitive impairment versus those that affect the underlying cortical structures that are the foundations of cognition and function. It's worth kind of remembering that dementia is not an inevitable consequence of aging, and certainly functional loss that comes with dementia is not a normal part of aging also. And the importance of an early and accurate diagnostic workup would be that there are a variety of conditions that masquerade as dementia. So we are always interested in things like medications, untreated, undiagnosed sleep apnea, depression, substance use, things that look on the surface, especially in the early stages, a lot like dementia. Also, even though we will talk a lot about Alzheimer's disease, you'll hear much about vascular brain injury from Dr. Personaire later this morning. Alzheimer's disease, being the most common form, is not the only form. And certainly in tertiary referral centers like where we are, we see a lot of individuals with frontotemporal dementia, with Lewy body disease, Parkinson's plus syndromes. Sometimes these terms seem to be used interchangeably, but keeping in mind that there's a much broader degree of conditions that cause dementia. And again, not all memory issues are indicative of Alzheimer's disease. So I want to also clarify that this is not a problem that is beholden to the United States alone. The world population is around 7.6 billion, and we know that right now about 9.9 million new cases of dementia occur each year. These are statistics from the World Health Organization. We have about, it looks like close to 46.8 million with Alzheimer's right now, with a projected prevalence by 2080 of 131.5 million. I had the honor and privilege of spending time in November in the Seychelles, out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, as we are forming a partnership with the Ministry of Health and the Alzheimer's Society in the Seychelles. And despite incredible linguistic and cultural differences, the impact of dementia, the family caregiver experience of dementia is so much the same. And it's amazing to see the needs kind of across the world, and indigenous populations. Their Creole population there is struggling significantly with greater rates of substance use, greater rates of head injury. Helmets aren't a thing there. So again, this is worldwide. And we know that our low and middle income countries are going to be driving these significant increases in prevalence. So right now, about 58% of all dementias are in low and middle income countries. That raises another 10% by 2050. And we also know that there is a significant difference in rates of diagnosis. So here in the United States and in Washington state in particular, about 45% of all individuals with dementia have a diagnosis in their medical record. In India, that's about 10%. So we've got a lot of work to do in terms of recognizing full-blown frank dementia, let alone mild cognitive impairment, and let alone being able to disentangle that reliably from the normal changes that occur as we age. A little closer to home, here in the United States, with 326 million individuals, we know that about 5.8 million have Alzheimer's disease, up this year from 5.7 last year. And we also know that we've got this rapidly aging population. So we've got 10,000 Americans reaching the age of 65, which is the greatest risk window for Alzheimer's disease. Our life expectancy has almost doubled since 1776. And we've got a growing American Indian Alaska Native population. Right now, 6.8 million as of the 2017 census. 10.4% are over the age of 65. About another 10% are 55 to 65. That has increased in the last 10 years and stands to increase significantly by 2050. And as we know, age kind of bands dictate risk. So 10% general risk in the population, perhaps as high as 50% at age 90. Whether you have the disease and don't have the cognitive symptoms, maybe up for grabs a little bit. But going from about 3% to about 33% if you're 65 to 74 versus 82 plus. And this group, both in our American Indian Alaska Native population as well as in our general population, is the group that's growing the fastest. So from 2010 out to 2050, we see in the purple our 85 plus group, which is growing significantly. So we've got a huge population for whom we need to be thinking about very carefully. How do we keep them cognitively healthy? How do we keep them on the end of the spectrum that's more towards normal cognitive aging that doesn't include functional loss? Some cost information. We know that dementia, especially in the late stages, is extraordinarily expensive to take care of. The best kind of comparative numbers I could find were still from 2010. We know that now it's about $818 billion to take care of all dementias. In 2010, it was 604, about 2.5 times more expensive than taking care of all of the vascular risk factors that we think about: stroke, heart disease. And with some projections in terms of the sheer number of American Indians, Alaska Native elders, projected 2050 prevalence of over 100,000. Right now, so in the state of Washington, we have about 110,000 individuals with dementia. And this would be kind of comparable to that number, to a tune of about $2.6 billion in healthcare costs. Some of the other staggering, but maybe encouragingly staggering numbers are from the last set of facts and figures from the Alzheimer's Association that early detection and diagnosis would yield about 7.9 trillion in cost savings. So again, this isn't disease prevention, eradication. This would be keeping people maybe functioning in the mild, early stage MCI. In terms of taking care of individuals with dementia, we certainly know in purple, if you have a health condition and Alzheimer's disease, it is significantly more expensive across all major health conditions. Same thing in terms of Medicare costs per beneficiary. So again, between the prevalence numbers, the healthcare economics numbers, the stage is set in that we really need to be doing a more careful job with detection, diagnosis, and a differential between what's normal and what's not. So I identify primarily as a clinician. And the most common question is, I've been noticing these things. I'm 75 years old. I've been noticing these things. And is this normal? Is this what I should be expecting? Or is there something else going on here? And as if any of you who do clinical work, in the very early stages, that's very difficult to disentangle. There's no clear functional impairment. There are no kind of startling examples of cognitive decline. And especially as we hit 75, 80, 85, or 90, what's normal, what's not? Some basic definitions as we move into that. There are acquired changes across a variety of domains. One of the first things that we think about are controlling for sensory changes. So certainly vision, hearing, olfaction, taste are all things that change as we age. And if you can control for the sensory piece and then start to look at cognition separate from that, it gets you a little clearer in terms of thinking about cognitive function. Disentangling the different components and types of memory, executive functioning, information processing, language abilities. So these are all kind of the rough domains where we have some data around what changes and what doesn't. And then, of course, cognition as a predictor of and related to ability to do functional things. So instrumental activities of daily living, your ability to manage finances, transportation, medications, versus your basic activities of daily living, bathing, toileting, eating. And with normal aging, you tend not to see neuropsychiatric features of more neurodegenerative disorders. So not that late life depression can't happen or late life anxiety can't happen, but they tend to be more exogenous versus endogenous kind of factors that drive that. I would also encourage you or remind you to think about cognition as separate from sensation. So if you think about kind of sensation and perception, it's more how the individual perceives the world around them, processes information, comprehends ideas, thinks about the future. We know that cognition is relatively stable in your young years and then declines gradually after about age 25 in certain domains, and then more rapidly as we hit our 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th decades. And critical, again, to remember that not just neurodegenerative disorders, not just dementia, drive change in cognition. And when we think about some of those differential risk factors that could accelerate cognitive aging, that's where we start to see different rates in different populations, including and especially American Indian, Alaska Native populations. I will also, as a clinical neuropsychologist and someone who's involved in research, remind you that we think about cognition relatively narrowly, right? So we have these domains and we have measures that are purported to assess these domains, but we don't assess things like wisdom, creativity. We don't assess kind of emotional intelligence in very robust ways. We've got excellent measures to disentangle short-term memory and learning, all the different components of that. But these are fairly narrow conceptions of what it means for cognitive function. And certainly very, very narrow as it gets to what's important to an individual or not. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. I do want to unpack a couple of these, especially executive functioning. One of my favorite mentors used to tell me that it takes frontal lobes to evaluate frontal lobes. And we know that executive functioning has a couple of different definitions and a couple of different frameworks or models by which to think about it. But certainly related to your frontal lobes, but not beholden to them entirely. Evidence for circuitry running through subcortical structures, even cerebellar structures. But if you think about executive functioning as largely kind of an organizational principle where you're planning, kind of monitoring things, you can think of that as if I'm doing something, am I doing it right? Do I need to modify my behavior? Am I reaching my intended goals? Versus regulation and inhibition. And certainly as we age, the frontal lobes appear to be some of the most vulnerable architecture to structural changes. And you see individuals who maybe exhibit some disinhibition. You can think of this as perhaps the older adult who has lost the filter and says whatever comes to mind, or maybe is more likely to say whatever comes to mind. You can imagine yourself in a meeting where you have certain thoughts and realize, oh, I probably shouldn't articulate these right at the moment. That's your frontal lobe kind of engaging and regulating. And certainly we also see older adults who have age-associated difficulties with the sequencing and planning of complex activities. Not that they can't do it, but it certainly becomes one of the areas that's sensitive to early cognitive change. Similarly, memory contains a variety of different constructs. We've got not just the division of short-term, long-term memory, but we've got procedural memory, we've got semantic memory, kind of your memory for knowledge and information, episodic memory, so events that have happened to you in your life, either remotely or recently. And if we kind of look at this, we know that some of these things tend to change as we age and others do not. So working memory, The speed of access to that may change, but your capacity may not change for ability to hold things in mind and manipulate it. Semantic memory, knowledge of facts, information, what a calculator is, those kinds of things tend not to change as we age. 8th, 9th decade, no big differences there. Similarly, episodic memory, right? Things that happened to me earlier in my life. You can put maybe episodic and semantic together in terms of stories that I was told, parts of my heritage that are important to remember. Those things tend to hang on. Short-term memory, what I did yesterday, what I had for lunch, the conversation we had, that changes. And there are a couple of different pieces for that we can talk about that change. Similarly, procedural memory tends not to change, or memory for how to do things. And in some of the clinical work that we do, we try to capitalize on that for individuals who have short-term memory problems, because you can circumvent that medial temporal lobe involvement and form new habits, get people doing kind of things in rote, routine ways. And then, of course, sensory memory, huge changes in that. So vision, olfaction, but not to the point of absence, right? So these aren't older adults who can't smell or taste anything, but there's certainly a muting that happens. If we think about short-term memory, I tend to think of it in 3 kind of simple stages. Well, attention being the first component, but then acquisition or encoding, storage, and retrieval. You got to pay attention, you got to get it in, you got to keep it there, you got to pull it back out when you need it later on. And with aging, it seems to be maybe not so much the storage piece, but maybe the acquisition piece, and maybe related to processing speed changes. And then some mild retrieval difficulties. So more, again, the frontal components of memory versus the mesial temporal lobe components. And again, related to aging and cognition, but slightly independent, is function. And I'll reference the good Dr. Galvin's work here. As people age, certainly function tends to stay intact from a cognitive standpoint. Individuals may have instrumental difficulty in terms of physical issues that preclude housework and other chores or maybe driving, but cognitively those abilities tend to remain. And you tend to see changes in things like complex financial management, driving in difficult locations, before you see difficulty with more basic activities. That's just the pattern of decline there. Also, we've talked a little bit about the fact that sensation changes. So we've got visual perceptual difficulties that change as vision changes and decreases, auditory problems with acuity. And in assessing this clinically, important to think about for any of you that do either clinical research or do clinical work, important to make sure that you're either accounting for this or controlling for this. So part of our work at the ADRC has been to acquire a pocket talker, which, for individuals who have hearing difficulty but don't have hearing aids, it's an amplifier which controls for some of the volume issues, right? Same thing with visuospatial problems or visual perceptual problems. We have a huge basket of cheater glasses that individuals can borrow. Just, you need to account for these things. So if we were to characterize normal aging, there's this kind of cascade that happens around age 65 where there's a decline, and then another that seems to occur around age 85. And this tends to be slightly progressive, but certainly not progressive to the point where function is impacted or abilities are impacted. And if we take this apart in terms of what this looks like on census-based population data, this is kind of what aging looks like. So on the left here, we have vocabulary, which is a good index of crystallized intelligence. And the blue line up top is average performance, kind of 50th percentile performance for a 20-year-old. The green bar is 50th percentile performance for a 50-year-old, and the gold is an 80-year-old. So for vocabulary, you actually see some improvements from 20 to 50, which is good. You kind of hope you get smarter as you get older. And then there's a slight kind of drop from 50 to 80, but no real difference between a 20-year-old's performance and an 80-year-old's performance. And some of that is language precision and some kind of word retrieval difficulties that drive that. Similarly, mental mathematics, so ability to calculate the tip on a check or maybe add up groceries quickly in your cart mentally. Not a big change between 20 to 80, maybe about a 15% reduction there. And similarly, verbal fluency. Not a huge change there. Important to note, too, that these are cross-sectional, not longitudinal data. As we start to get into maybe more kind of frontally mediated and demanding tasks, we see things like auditory attention not changing too much. Span certainly doesn't change very much. Working memory, you see more of a drop, and maybe somewhere on the order of about a 37% decline from 20 to 80. And again, not necessarily in capacity, but the speed at which 80-year-olds can access the working memory store. On a measure of picture ordering, which has got a little higher level executive demand around sequencing, you see more of maybe a 50% reduction from 20 to 80. And then as we increase some executive demands, selective attention, so that ability to pay attention to one thing while ignoring something else. It could be the traffic outside or hunger pangs or whatever it may be. Again, about a 50% drop from 20 to 80. Mental flexibility, similar order of magnitude. And when we get to memory, that's where we start to see some of the more striking changes over decades, particularly for visuospatial information. So there's about a 74% decline in delayed recall of visual information. And this is not completely controlling for visual loss, so that might be driving some of this. But we know that, for the short story here, this is a well-known kind of a paragraph story. If a 20-year-old would remember about 25 out of 30 bits of information after a half-hour delay, an 80-year-old may remember 10, 11, and that would be pretty healthy, normal aging, right? So we've got a good sense of the things that tend not to change in terms of overall intelligence, procedural memory. And then we've got some declines in other areas that we've talked about a little bit. Another kind of a summary slide, more recent population data. Again, cross-sectional here, not longitudinal, showing kind of an increase in verbal ability and numeric ability from our mid-20s up to our mid-50s. And then everything either kind of plateaus or, in the case of things like perceptual speed, processing speed, that's where we start to see some declines, especially as we move into our 80s. So why does this happen, right? A couple of reasons. One is certainly there is a strong physiological basis for this, as we have neurons that are aging and becoming less myelinated. We have some kind of dendritic pruning that happens as we age, so less complex connections between the cells, which also is related to having fewer of the chemicals around that the brain uses to communicate. We know that blood flow changes, particularly to the frontal temporal lobes. And this is clearly location specific. So subcortical structures are relatively spared, whereas frontal lobes, especially after the age of about 70, 75, there seems to be a significant decline there. And of course, these aren't independent from other risk factors and components of aging. So there are several vascular risk factors that seem to speed up or precipitate healthy cognitive aging, not necessarily indicative of vascular cognitive impairment, but certainly sets the stage for it. So things like diabetes, obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, head injury, alcohol use. I mean, these are all familiar topics, especially as we start to think about risks in American Indian, Alaska Native populations. Prevalence rates are significantly higher, and there's some really lovely data from colleagues here in the room and former colleagues, including Brenna Charlton, who was here for a while, now down at Stanford. And in her study, it was a subgroup of the strong heart population, found that 80% of her population in that study had hypertension, 48%, almost 50%, with diabetes, 40% with dyslipidemia, and also found that whole brain volume on volumetric MRI was related to slower speed, processing speed. That seemed to be the most robust finding, and also around verbal learning, but not necessarily recall. But interesting kind of sub-piece of this, breaking out left hippocampal volumes, pulled that relationship out where learning and recall were impacted or related. And there are also some nice studies that look at some of the differential risk kind of exposure for toxins within Alaska Native and American Indian populations, including one here in the Northwest, which is looking at toxin exposure via razor clam intake out on the coastal tribes. That's the Tracy et al. Paper from 2016. And then another interesting one up in northern New York, looking at PCB exposure and breaking the population out into participants that were age 40 and above, showed a relationship with processing speed and possibly attention, kind of a weak relationship there, but not in younger Mohawk populations. Also, again, we know that risk of different cardiovascular conditions is disproportionate in our American Indian and Alaska Native populations. Caucasian general prevalence is around 6.2%, up to 9% is probably a conservative estimate in some studies. And a nice paper by Rhoads and colleagues, unrelated, that looked at hypertension and diabetes escalating in our American Indian population despite smoking cessation that preceded that. And then a more recent study that was just published earlier this year with our American Indian veterans. This was truly interesting because at the time of selection for the study, none had diagnosis of cognitive impairment, none had significant self-reported cognitive impairment, and there were about 123 participants in the study. 44% had abnormal MoCA scores, which is the gold standard in cognitive screening, although you could argue maybe oversensitive, particularly in non-Caucasian populations. But they found that 4 were cognitively normal out of the 15 that received a more comprehensive workup. And 3 of those 4 were normal on the MoCA but requested a further cognitive workup because they became concerned as they started talking about cognitive changes, possible cognitive changes. 4 had non-amnestic MCI. This was executive and attention. And 5 had vascular MCI, 2 with vascular dementia. And this was neuropsych eval, MRI, comprehensive labs, neurology consults. This was a comprehensive workup. So pointing out that, especially in our American Indian veteran population, frequently undiagnosed vascular cognitive impairment, which fits with some other studies. So there are certainly physiological and medical risks that accelerate and precipitate cognitive aging and performance on neurocognitive measures. But we also know that there's not just and as a neuropsychologist, there's the neuro part of it, there's the psychologist part of it, and the psychologist part of it for me is kind of the stereotype threat idea that if you think you aren't going to do well on a particular thing, you tend not to do well on it, right? And there is a lovely study, this has been demonstrated in a couple of different populations, but the one that I will point you to is the conditions were basically that it's the same task, younger adults, older adults, and in one condition it was this is a memory test, the other this is a test or a game to see how well you learn trivia. And when it was the memory test instructions, the younger adults did significantly better. When it was the trivia kind of game instructions, no difference between performance in either group. And you see this in IQ testing in African American and Caucasian children. If you tell them it's an IQ test, guess who does better? If you tell them it's a game, no difference. We also have significant sociocultural determinants of normality and cognitive performance. We don't do a lot of thinking, I don't sense, around the importance of defining what's normal and what's not from a cultural standpoint. We have these criterion-referenced normative data sets for neurocognitive performance, but we don't really ask how important that is to somebody. And we certainly don't do much asking sometimes around what functional domains and impairments would indicate problems for you. So in some of the work that I was privileged to do with Deidre over in Yakima, where we screened a number of American Indian and Alaska Native older adults with the MiniCog, it came up more than once, and it's come up clinically more than once, that, yeah, my short-term memory is not very good, but that doesn't really matter. I still remember my language, I still remember the stories my grandmother told me, I can still participate in my community events, so, what I had for dinner or those 3 words you just gave me, not really that critical, right? We also don't always look at acculturation as a predictor or a determinant of what we should be thinking about as an appropriate criterion. So some lovely work by Ferraro and colleagues that would say on some neuropsychological measures, Boston Naming Test, a few others, the CASI, that, boy, performance for American Indian elders looks very, very similar to Caucasian elders, but these were highly acculturated tribes. And does that hold up for more rural or different places? We don't know, right? So you can't make that assumption. Certainly, socioeconomic status is a huge driver of cognitive performance and sets the stage for how people interface with healthcare and a variety of other things. And we know that there's a huge difference between rural and urban American Indians, about a 70%, I believe if the number was right from Dr. Manson's work, that rural American Indians had about 70% of the income of those for urban. We don't do much in the way about thinking about how does this item or this measure translate, both in terms of language but also culturally. And how does that fit within cultural logic, which is probably a determinant of cognitive function and, more importantly, actual function. And then certainly education, task familiarity. And not just years of education, but type of education proves to be very important, educational experience. We'll come back to that in a second. So we still, I think, have this massive mandate of rethinking the way we assess cognition, the tools that we use, the items that we use, and certainly the data sets that we use to interpret it. So we're not there. I wish I had better news. But if we look at some of the things, and we have some data that gives us some guidance around how we should be thinking about this and maybe some approaches that we should be taking. If we look at one of the most common measures that's used clinically, it's still used in research as a measure of global cognitive function, although I would argue against that. The MiniMental status examination, it was a forerunner. It was published in the mid-1970s. It's still the most frequently used tool here in the state of Washington in our rural primary care settings, because it's what providers were trained on. It's 30 items, 6 domains. It's memory heavy. It's executive functioning kind of light, which makes you think about what might get missed there. It's got marginal sensitivity and specificity. It's got a classification rate that is not stellar, and it certainly can be improved if you use age and education effects and norms, but in which population, right? So we know that from the SALSA study that the performance on the MiniMental status examination in a Latino population was driven more by socioeconomic status, neighborhood effects, which are related, language ability, education, and that the false positive rate was 7 times higher in this population than it was for Caucasians. Similarly, the MiniMental performs that same way in American Indian and Alaska Native populations. So if you use age norms, you've got roughly 10 to 27% of people who were impaired in this population. But if you do age and education norms, it goes up to about 81%. And there's no way that 81% of this population selected for this study had cognitive impairment, at least significant cognitive impairment. Some, sure, but not that proportion. We also know that from this study, the type of education, so going to a boarding school versus education in a more rural setting was predictive of performance and related to language. Socioeconomic status, those who had a higher need for Social Security income, supplemental Security income, had poorer performance, and those who had access to necessary health care throughout the lifespan had better performance. And then raise the question around, are there even peri or prenatal factors that shape the way American Indian, Alaska Native elders do aging? And at least in the 2010 study, there were no clear effects related to gender or blood quantum. In the 2007 study, there was a gender difference there, but it was also a hugely kind of underrepresented for male participants. The other thing I think that this kind of makes us rethink is in the data sets that we have and the way that we think about cognitive aging, we probably need to do a finer grained job of knowing kind of who we're looking at. So from the ACT study here in Seattle, we've got brain autopsy results from cognitively healthy individuals. And on the top, these are individuals that did not have dementia at the time of autopsy, but this is their neuropathological burden. And on the left is the high cognitive performing group. On the right is the low cognitive performing group. This was on the CASI, but still not ranked as cognitively impaired. Certainly didn't meet criteria for MCI or dementia. And they've got a pretty significant amount of burden. Blue is Alzheimer's disease, red is microvascular ischemic change, and green is Lewy body, presence of Lewy bodies. And then the middle group here is those who were diagnosed with dementia early on the left, late on the right. So certainly some of our quote-unquote cognitively normal individuals have neuropathological and other neurological conditions. So how does that shape the way we, the lens through which we look at things? Okay, so we talked kind of this curve of decline, maybe a plateauing in our mid-20s, then around 65, there's a drop, in 85, another drop. And then for other individuals, and you'll hear much more about this from Dr. Hansen, Dr. Personaire, who have a different trajectory. And there's this gradual accumulation of neuropathology that leads to a different cognitive course. And you could have no symptoms related to that. You could have MCI, you could have full-blown dementia. And as we think about treatment, the idea of being able to suppress that pathology and maybe keeping people up in the pre-symptomatic and mild cognitive impairment stages. So again, you can't cure Alzheimer's disease, can't fully prevent it, but is there a way to kind of lean into the disease and maybe even build healthier brains as we have kids in school and think about the way they participate in youth sports? And I think I will close before we open it up for conversation, summarizing that, again, we have this absolutely critical need for culturally appropriate and ecologically meaningful measures and normative data sets. One of the biggest challenges as a clinician when there's someone who I don't have a good normative data set for is to cull through what's available and see what I can find that's close. And then what do you do with that? And my approach usually is to score things a couple of different ways and look at it somewhere in the middle. But there's also this really interesting trend towards maybe not so criterion or even domain referenced kind of interpretation, but to look at scatter and spread of cognitive scores within an individual and then how that changes over time. So the work of Kerry Gleason and colleagues in Wisconsin or David Shretlin in Baltimore, thinking about within aging, there's a certain amount of variability that we have in our cognitive functioning, strengths and weaknesses, and we kind of move through time with that. And as we develop a neurocognitive disorder, that spread becomes greater as some domains change, others do not. And then as we age and progress down that pathway, the spread shrinks again. So in terms of longitudinal assessment, being able to look at heterogeneity in scores, so there are some statistical techniques that have been helpful for that. And then a paper that I came across recently in another context, expanding on the work of Monroe Cullum and colleagues, looking at the viability and applicability of telemedicine cognitive assessment for rural populations. And this is of particular interest for me. I just found out this morning that our state legislature has approved funds for us to create a telemedicine network here in the state of Washington around dementia. And so we're thinking about how we might partner with some of our tribal clinics and leverage that technology to do some clinical work and maybe collect some data. So that's, stay tuned. Maybe we'll have an update on that in a few years. All right. And with that, I was going to carve out some time for questions, conversation, observations.